Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we have the case of Elisabeth Fritzl. There are probably going to be some issues with pronunciation because some of the names are in German, but I'll do the best I can. This case is also known as the case of the Monster of Amstetten. And actually, I covered this a really long time ago. When I started this channel about 4 or 5 years ago, I made this video in an incredibly short way. And this story has a ton of information, so it can't really be told briefly, and I wanted to fix that video. So, after all this time, finally, I'm gonna do it again. So get ready, because this video's probably gonna be pretty long. Up here, on the eye that's on the screen, you can check out the rest of my cases. Down here, you'll find my social media in case you want to follow me on any of them, and with nothing more to say, let's get started. This is Elisabeth Fritzl. She was born on April 6, 1966, in Amstetten, Austria. Amstetten is a city with just over 20,000 residents, located in Lower Austria, one of Austria's 9 states. It wasn't a small town, but it wasn't a big city either. Nothing really attention-grabbing usually happened there, until this case. It was strange for people to witness something so horrific up close, and for the first time, they were surrounded by cameras and journalists. To start the story, I have to tell you about Elisabeth's father, who, as many of you already know and may have guessed, is the other main character in this terrible story. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in Amstetten, Austria. He spent his entire childhood during the Second World War, a war in which his father served as a soldier and died in action in 1944. However, when he was very young, his parents had already separated and he grew up only with his mother, who actually didn't want to have children. In fact, it seems she didn't even want him. She wasn't a very affectionate mother. She took it out on him, hitting him every chance she got. She would leave him alone for hours, and the only time she saw him, she showed him absolutely no love, quite the opposite. All of this probably caused something in him that couldn't be fixed, and he ended up repeating that same behavior once he was married with his own wife and children. After finishing high school, Fritzl began studying electrical engineering, and at 21, he married a 17-year-old girl named Rosemary. They lived together in a house in Amstetten and seemed to lead a normal, peaceful life with the 7 children they had together. In fact, Joseph was well-liked everywhere, at work, in the town. Everyone knew him, and he seemed very friendly on the outside. But this was far from what was really happening inside his home and with his family. Joseph was a very violent man. He constantly abused his wife and his children. At that time, he was, as people described him, a very strict man. However, he crossed the line of being just strict. At one point in his life, he started having somewhat more perverse ideas. He would spy on people through the windows of their homes, especially during more intimate moments. And over time, he began following certain women on the streets or in parks. Behind them, he would not only walk, but also masturbate. Not because he necessarily wanted to be seen, he would just follow them while doing that. There are also certain sources that report that Josef was involved in attempted sexual assault or even outright sexual assault, one of them specifically in 1967 when he was 24 years old. In other words, by that point, he had taken things a step further. He had stopped just following people and was now starting to act. 12 years after getting married, he carried out an attack by following a woman and sexually assaulting her after breaking into her house by force. After this, he was reported and had to serve 18 months in prison. At that time, Rosemary didn't decide to leave, and so when he got out of prison, his family was still with him. What Josef Fritzl did was probably because he didn't want to get caught fulfilling these perverse fantasies he had. He needed someone with whom he could do it in private. That's when Elisabeth was born, the 4th of 7 siblings, who had to endure a tough childhood, suffering mistreatment and physical abuse from her father. It was in 1977, when Elisabeth was 11 years old, that the abuse from her father took on a different nature, specifically a sexual one. Throughout her entire adolescence, Elisabeth didn't have a shred of privacy. Her father checked absolutely everything, her room, including her diary, and for her part, she lived hidden away in her own home, following her father's orders. The only time he really let her go out was with him. Before taking any of his other children, or even his own wife, out to do things, Josef would take Elisabeth. The abuse continued frequently over the following years. In an attempt to escape the hell she was living in, Elisabeth ran away from home at 15 and hid with a friend in Vienna. They had run as far away as they could at that time. When the police found her 3 weeks later, they returned her to her parents' home, without even suspecting the horrors taking place there, or even asking why she had run away. Beyond the abuse, her family described her as a very sweet girl who would sit for hours by the window, watching people go by. She was very quiet and calm, especially around her family. Actually, she was less calm with her friends. She laughed and acted pretty much like a normal girl. But once they got to her house, even though Josef wouldn't let anyone pass the front door, they noticed that Elisabeth became very reserved, and every time he showed up, she would just go silent. She became especially shy around him. She also didn't take part in things that were common among teenagers, especially when it came to romantic conversations. Like if a girl liked someone in her class, she didn't get involved in those things. It was as if the topic made her a little scared. And, of course, as you can imagine, Josef didn't let her have a boyfriend or anything like that. In fact, she couldn't even get close to boys. Elisabeth's life continued with abuse and increasingly intense fights with her father, until at 18 years old, on August 28, 1984, Elisabeth Fritzl suddenly disappeared overnight. At that time, she didn't take any of her belongings, nor any money or identification that would be useful for leaving to another country or state. She had simply left. It's very hard to explain how no one noticed, especially her mother, what was really happening to Elisabeth. After she disappeared, her mother started to worry, but it wasn't until a month later that she reported her disappearance to the police. To calm his wife's worries, and especially to try to keep the police from getting involved in any investigation that could implicate him, Josef came up with a pretty unbelievable story. What's really unbelievable is that the family actually thought this was true. Josef arranged for a letter from Elisabeth to arrive, in which she said she had left to join a cult and was going to start a new life. This letter was written by Elisabeth herself, but obviously it was fake, and nothing more than a letter Josef forced her to write. Since this matched up with Elisabeth's previous attempts to run away and her behavior of wanting to leave, there wasn't much more to say. Her friends, however, didn't believe that was the truth. They knew her, and knew there was no way she could just leave, much less join a cult. She hardly ever left her house. She couldn't have run away either. That was impossible with a father like hers. She only left to go to school. Her family was very strict. She would have had to meet someone from a group like that, and Elisabeth just couldn't. There was simply no way that could have happened. Still, both Rosemary, her siblings, and the neighbors stuck to the idea that she had run away to join this cult. Even so, there were people who thought it was a little strange and searched for her anyway. Like her aunt, Christine Runner, for example. The incredible thing is that even though she was actively alert, she still didn't notice what was really happening, even though she did see that Josef was a bit abnormal. I'm going to explain what the terrible truth behind this story was, and why it's so strange to me, and to all of us, that no one noticed or did anything, even though there is an explanation. Elisabeth didn't run away anywhere, and she wasn't in any cult or anything like that. On August 28, 1984, Josef Fritzl called his daughter Elisabeth, who was 18 at the time, using the excuse that he needed her help with some tasks in the basement, so she would go down there. Once they were downstairs, he asked her to help him install a door, which would become the door to her cell. In the middle of it, a fight broke out between the two of them, as always, and Josef, taking advantage of the fact that his wife wasn't home, this time knocked his daughter out with chloroform and handcuffed her. After that, he locked her in the cell, where she would remain for the next 24 years. The whole time Josef had been working on his basement, he had been preparing it for this. It would be the place where he would lock up his daughter so he could do whatever he wanted to her. And so Josef continued living a normal life upstairs, but when he went down to the basement, he committed the most cruel and disgusting acts. The basement was soundproofed so that no noises could be heard from outside, and Josef had strictly forbidden any member of his family from going near it. Being so strict and violent, no one ever dared to contradict him. In those 24 years, not a single person who was in the house ever wanted to go near the basement. For years, Elisabeth lived in a small cell of about 30 square meters, with no windows and in poor sanitary conditions. Let's remember that she couldn't have even a ray of sunlight, because he couldn't risk leaving a window where someone might see her. In any case, it was also forbidden to go into the backyard of the house. No one was allowed there unless they were his children, since Elisabeth was directly beneath the yard. Josef Fritzl only went down to see her to bring her food or to abuse and humiliate her in unimaginable ways. As a result of the repeated abuse, Elisabeth gave birth to a total of 7 children, who were both children and grandchildren of Josef. The first was born on August 30th, 1988. She was a girl named Kirsten. Elisabeth had to give birth alone in the basement, since Josef refused to take her to the hospital. All he did was give her 2 books about how babies are born and leave her alone to have her first daughter. Luckily, everything turned out fine. 2 years later, Stefan was born. At first, Josef planned for these children to also remain captive in the basement with their mother, but Elisabeth kept getting pregnant. When the third daughter, Lisa, was born in 1991, there was no longer enough room for everyone in the small cell, so Josef went back to the cult story to involve the next children a bit. He put baby Lisa in a basket at his own doorstep, and on top of the basket, he left a letter from Elisabeth saying that Lisa was her daughter, that babies weren't accepted in her cult, and asking them to take care of her until she was older, at which point she would come back for her. This letter, again, wasn't true. The part about the cult, of course, had nothing to do with it. But it was written by Elisabeth because she was being forced to do so. Josef put Elisabeth and her children to work expanding the cell to 50 square meters. The fourth daughter, Monica, was born in February 1994 and was also taken upstairs. Using a method similar to the one he used with Lisa, only this time, Josef used a recording of Elisabeth, who was obviously forced as well, in which she asked them to take care of the baby, just like the first time. In April 1996, twins were born, but one of them died 3 days after birth. What the baby had was treatable, but Josef once again refused to take him to the hospital, even though Elisabeth begged him over and over. He let the baby die, took the body, and proceeded to cremate it, so there would be no evidence left. The other twin, Alexander, the one who survived, was taken upstairs with the same story as his previous siblings. The last child, Felix, was born in December 2002, but Josef decided to leave him in the basement since he believed that Rosemarie wouldn't tolerate the arrival of another child, supposedly sent by Elisabeth. This created a situation where 3 of the children, known as the upstairs siblings, lived in the house raised by Fritzl and Rosemarie, having no idea whatsoever about what was happening in the basement of the house. Meanwhile, the other 3 siblings, known as the downstairs siblings, lived in captivity in the small cell along with their mother. Josef also told them that if they tried to escape, gas would come in through the ventilation and it would kill them. On the other hand, if they touched the main door, they would get an electric shock, so they couldn't try to escape. They couldn't verify any of these things, but they were so afraid of him that they preferred not to try. Despite the torture, Elisabeth did her best to give her children the best life she could. She taught them to read and write, gave them lessons, and all the love she could. They also had well-established routines, mostly so they wouldn't lose their sanity in there. Josef was an extremely sadistic man. He enjoyed other people's pain. He chose the ones upstairs because they were the noisiest babies, so they wouldn't attract as much attention. And he gave them special treatment. in the sense that he gave them a normal life, but also a fun one. That is, they could enjoy not only the sun, but also the garden, which no one else was allowed to enter, and they also got to play with a toy or two. So what Josef did was take pictures of these moments he created with his children upstairs and showed them to those who were locked up, to show them what those lives were like. Not in an attempt to be empathetic or to give them hope, but quite the opposite. He showed them what the sun was like, the garden, all these things, just to watch them suffer. For his part, Josef had quit his job as an engineer to start his own real estate company. This way, his schedule was more flexible and he could go back to the basement to continue the torture. Also, every so often, he would go on business trips and disappear for days. He used that time to shop in remote places, or to throw away the bunker's trash where no one would see him. He divided those days into two parts, one part for the hidden family and the other for the visible family. For the visible family, he would do the grocery shopping at the local supermarket, so everyone would see him. No one suspected a thing. And for the hidden family, he would go as far away as possible to do the shopping, so no one could recognize him or wonder why he was doing it, why he was buying so many things, or anything like that. That's how 24 years went by, with Elisabeth raising her children in captivity, in a place without a single ray of sunlight. Just imagine what it does to you to grow up without even a little sunlight. However, all of this changed on April 19th, 2008. Kirsten, Elisabeth's first daughter, was sick and feeling very unwell. For several days, Elisabeth begged Josef to take her to the doctor so she could get medical attention. That day, the 19th, he finally agreed and took her to the local hospital. Kirsten was admitted to the hospital with a severe case of kidney failure, which was an urgent situation. One of the first things they noticed was that the girl had no papers. As far as the state was concerned, she didn't exist. There were no records of her anywhere, since, remember, she was born in the bunker and never left. In other words, no one really knew this person even existed. While the doctors were treating her, they discovered something that caught their attention even more. In the young woman's pocket, there was a note that was actually written by Elisabeth and intentionally placed there, where she asked for help and explained the situation she was living through. When they searched for Elisabeth's name, they realized that Kirsten's mother was a woman who had been missing for years. When the doctors asked Josef about this, he gave an answer that left the staff with several doubts, so they decided to notify the police. The police, for their part, discovered that this supposed grandfather of the hospitalized girl is also Elisabeth Fritzl's father. This alone wouldn't be strange, but the situation at the hospital made it seem like something was being hidden. The girl had no identity despite being his granddaughter, and she responded to everything in a hostile way. She seemed angry all the time, was arrogant, and at the same time didn't want to answer important questions, things that could save his granddaughter and help provide a better diagnosis of her situation. He first said that his granddaughter Kirsten had been left at his doorstep with a note that seemed to be from Elisabeth. The note said that she was sick and that they should take care of her. The police began to question Josef, who once again tried to deceive them with the story that Elisabeth was in a cult. But this time, the police had some doubts about this story, so they kept investigating. The doctors got involved in the search for Elisabeth, asking her to come back because they had no medical records for her daughter. Maybe, if she returned, she would know something that could help them. Kirsten was in a coma, and they were doing everything they could to save her. Finding himself cornered by the situation and faced with Elisabeth's pleas to see her daughter Kirsten, who was suffering in the hospital, a week after taking Kirsten to the hospital, Josef decided to release Elisabeth and her children on April 26, 2008. After more than 24 years locked away, Elisabeth was finally able to go out again to see her daughter in the hospital, an opportunity she did not waste. The first thing she did was go see her daughter. However, this was just a visit. She didn't want to talk to anyone and seemed very scared. Also, by that time, she was already 40 years old, an age she had reached in a terrible way. She looked 20 years older, had aged dramatically, her skin was in very bad shape, and she looked completely pale. She also looked thick. When the doctors saw Elisabeth arrive, given everything that was happening, they notified the police, who took her in to make a statement. In fact, at first, they were about to accuse her of being an accomplice to the confinement. She had to explain her story and counter what the police believed. But the officers weren't expecting what had really happened. At first, Elisabeth didn't want to talk, but she finally agreed to tell them on the condition that they promised she would never have to see Josef again for the rest of her life. Once they promised her this, she spent several hours telling them about all the horrors she had suffered during those long 24 years. She was never in a cult or anything like that. She was locked up by her father in a basement, specially built for that purpose, in 1984. She also said that her daughter Kirsten spent all 19 years of her life, from the day she was born until she was hospitalized, inside that basement with her mother and her 6 siblings. She also recounted how Josef had forced her to have 7 children with him. And, of course, such a story quickly made the news. The next day, everyone knew about it. The father, who had never let his daughter go outside all that time and had done terrible things to her, was finally, at the very least, facing public condemnation. Meanwhile, Elisabeth's friends, acquaintances, and neighbors who had seen her disappear were finally giving an answer in the morning paper. Out of nowhere, her face was everywhere, and they just couldn't believe it. As I said at the beginning of the video, Josef Fritzl didn't want to go back to prison. He didn't want to go through that again. But he still wanted to satisfy those perversions he had. So, 6 years before everything happened, he decided to come up with the perfect plan. First, he applied for the necessary permits to build a bomb shelter in his house, which, given the time period and what Fritzl had experienced, didn't seem all that strange. The best part for him in this situation was that his knowledge as an electrical engineer allowed him to do all the wiring and everything else by himself. He didn't need anyone else to check anything, and since he was so strict, no one in the family bothered him. As time went by, this bomb bunker kept getting bigger. Afraid that his family might disobey him, he put a lock on the door for extra security. It was an electronic lock that required a code for access and a remote control that only he had. As you can see, the entrance door was hidden behind some shelves, and through a very narrow hallway, you reach the main area, which consisted of a kitchen and a bathroom. Beyond that, there were 2 rooms that apparently were enough to keep Elisabeth and her children away when Josef came in. A pipe provided ventilation. According to the police, each of these 2 bedrooms had 2 beds. At least part of his bunker seemed to be padded and well soundproofed. A disturbing detail was also that Josef had rented out a room or 2 in his house to several people. In total, more than 100 people passed through this place. Each of the people who rented rooms from him was told that if they went near the basement and tried to open it, there would be immediate consequences, and they would have to leave the house. The same went for the garden. The yard was absolutely off limits because, of course, it was right above the hidden rooms. One of the tenants, in fact, had a dog that would sometimes act strangely. He would start barking softly, even though nothing seemed out of place. His owner had no idea what could be going on. Maybe the dog was hearing something he couldn't. Josef made the bunker impossible to escape from. In those 6 years before trapping his daughter, he did everything perfectly to have a place where he could carry out his plans without anyone interfering. After all of this came to light, Josef was put in prison awaiting trial, and Elisabeth, along with her children, were taken to receive medical and psychological assistance. The trial was held in March 2009. Josef was charged with rape, kidnapping, incest, slavery, and homicide for the twin who died because he didn't take him to the hospital, among many other charges. Josef Fritzl pleaded guilty to most of them. However, for some charges, like homicide, he pleaded not guilty. That's why the trial went on for several days. There was tons of evidence of everything he had done, including more than 10 hours of recordings of Elisabeth recounting all the details of what she had suffered. Those who attended the trial said they couldn't bear to listen to more than a few minutes of what she described. When it was her turn to testify at the trial, Elisabeth wrote this in a notebook, since she didn't want to be present because Josef was there. The next day, Josef Fritzl changed his mind and pleaded guilty to all charges, being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Josef never showed any remorse for what he did, and has made very controversial statements, like saying he was born to rape and that everything he did with his daughter was out of love, along with many other things that aren't worth mentioning but are terrible nonetheless. On the other hand, other people who were accused of being partly responsible were the social services. The family had legally adopted 3 children, who were Elisabeth's kids and lived upstairs. They were visited by agents to check on their situation and see if everything was okay, but they never really asked in depth where the children had come from, nor did they find the way the children arrived at the house suspicious. They were satisfied with the letters, which were handwritten and signed by Elisabeth anyway, so there wasn't much more they could do. Those responsible for approving construction at the time also went to check that everything was fine with the bunker's construction. And, of course, since Josef hadn't started using that place as a prison yet, nothing happened. On the other hand, both Elisabeth, all her children, and also Rosemary were given new identities and relocated to a new city, which remains undisclosed, so they can start a new life without prejudice. In addition, they receive ongoing psychological and psychiatric support. The only positive thing I can take from this story is that when Felix, Elisabeth's youngest child, came out of the basement, he had one of the best reactions. He couldn't stop looking outside. He couldn't take his eyes off the car window as they drove him, because it was the first time in his life he was seeing everything. It's sad, and at the same time, a little touching, but also very sad. And among all of them, he was actually the one who handled leaving the basement the best, because remember, he was the one who spent the least amount of years there. However, for some of the kids, it wasn't that easy. Being outside for the first time comes with a lot of things. For one, the sunlight is blinding. There's a huge difference between living locked up in a basement and living in society, having to go through all the experiences they missed out on in there. But at least we can say that they're free now, that they can finally start living, even though this happened a few years ago, so they've probably gotten more used to it by now. This case has sparked a lot of controversy and debating. Without a doubt, one of the biggest issues is the fact that nobody realized there were several people being held captive in the basement of a house. There are several accounts that say some neighbors were suspicious, but it wasn't common back then for neighbors to get involved in other people's lives. It wasn't considered appropriate to get involved in these kinds of matters. But as we've already seen, in this case, there was no other way. Usually, if no one steps in to help others, nothing happens. One of the people most criticized for all this, even by Elisabeth herself, was Rosemary. Elisabeth said it was hard for her to believe that Rosemary hadn't noticed anything, and that she believed the whole story about the cult and everything else. Some people think that Rosemary might have been an accomplice in all of this. However, the authorities dismissed any charges against her. One possible explanation is that Rosemary was simply abused by Fritzl, so she was probably afraid of him. That's why she never contradicted him and followed his orders, like not being allowed near the basement out of fear of the consequences. The truth is, she probably did realize what was going on. Maybe she just didn't want to believe that her daughter was locked up down there, being abused by her own father. Maybe she didn't know exactly what was happening because she didn't have access to the basement. If she ever went in and her husband found out, we don't know what could have happened to her. In a case like this, where there's so much psychological and physical abuse, it's hard for a victim to just stand up to their abuser and challenge him. Discovering something as terrible as what was happening without really being able to do anything about it, because remember, not only was the basement door locked with a password, but she also wasn't even allowed to get within a few meters of the basement. Discovering that something like this was happening in her own home, something so terrible, could have been even worse psychologically, since she wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. There was probably a lot of denial inside her. Also, considering that the family had access to psychologists and that they were likely examined to determine what was happening inside the house, I doubt she was an accomplice by choice, in any case. She would be more of an accomplice for not trying to find out what was happening, but again, she was a victim of abuse, just like all the children and everyone else who was inside. According to what we know, Elisabeth and her children are healthy today and trying to move on with their lives after all the horror they went through. So, well, that's all the information we have for now. Let me know what you think about the case down below in the comments. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.